engineers and general contractors kind of adapting to some of these current climate challenges to kind of keep their projects on time and on budget? Because that's always what we're going for, on time and on budget.
It's a great point. I've interviewed perhaps a few dozen, maybe several dozen operators and owners of general contracting and engineering firms.
Did you know that nearly 80% of construction projects experience delays or cost overruns? These staggering statistics expose the harsh reality of the construction industry, where the pressure to meet tight deadlines and budgets can put contractors and engineers at the risk of compromising safety and quality. In today's episode, I'm excited to have Devlin Fenton, CEO of Arch Engineers, joining us to talk about the rapidly evolving risk profiles in the engineering and construction industry, from shifting risk allocation and changing legal frameworks to the growing impact of AI and automation. We'll uncover how these changes are transforming project delivery and shaping the future of our industry. I'm your host, Anthony Fasano, and this is the Civil Engineering CEO. All right, now I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today. Devlin Fenton is the CEO of Arch Engineers. Devlin, welcome to the Civil Engineering CEO Show.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Very kind of you to invite me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. So just to get us started, Devlin, maybe you could just tell us a little about yourself, your background, and the company. How big is the company? About how many employees do you have? Where are you located?
Sure. So I've been in Canada now for 17 years. The majority of that time I've been in heavy civil construction. The most of that was spent running a crane company. Spent a lot of time on transportation infrastructure like bridges, culverts, energy projects, whether it's oil and gas or renewable energy projects. Some of that time I spent running a tech company. We did an Uberization of freight. So basically a platform that was matching capacity on trucks with shippers who needed cargo moved. And then for the last 4 years or so, I've been running this structural and civil engineering company. So we focus on similar sectors being transportation infrastructure, energy, upstream and midstream, also the renewable space, and then the resource sector, so mining and forestry. So it's a lot of structural and civil, geostructural type work, and that's right across Canada, from Ontario to British Columbia, including the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. And then we've got a handful of US states that we operate in, kind of down the Rockies from Washington down to Texas. The team is about a dozen people here in the headquarters of North Vancouver. And then these technical experts, we've developed a system of managing and coordinating a decentralized team. So we've got another equally sized group of teams spread out in different geographies from the US to South Africa to India. And each team is specialized in a different way. So we leverage the time zones where we can to deliver work faster, and we leverage those skill sets where it serves our clients best.
That's great. That's really interesting. I think right off the bat, there's a lot of really good that can come out of kind of diversifying your workforce into different locations, of course, decentralized, like you mentioned. Obviously, you have less of a limit on talent because you have like no geographic boundaries, which is really beneficial. And then, like you said, you can really leverage time zones. We've done that at EMI as well. So someone puts a full day on, passes off to someone else who's just getting started type of thing. So
Yeah.
that can work very well. All right, so we're going to jump into some interesting topics here today with Devlin. So let me start with this one for you, Devlin. With design flaws these days, there might be incomplete documentation on projects. Scopes have been more and more vague, which shifts kind of risks onto contractors. How are engineers and general contractors kind of adapting to some of these current climate challenges to kind of keep their projects on time and on budget? Because that's always what we're going for, on time and on budget.
It's a great point. I've interviewed perhaps a few dozen, maybe several dozen operators and owners of general contracting and engineering firms. Architectural firms are very similar, and it's industry wide across North America. This trend towards putting out drawings for tender phase that could be anything from 50 to maybe 60% complete. And so that means the contractors are bidding on work where they're adopting a huge amount of risk. They don't really know what the work is. And then similarly, even construction drawings are coming from the owner's rep to the winning contractor, and they might be 80, they might be 90% complete. And so that incompleteness does shift a lot of risk down the hill toward the general contractor. Some might say that that's unfair risk, or at least the shifting of risk. But it is the business of general contracting. I think it'd be hard to find a construction company operator that doesn't say or doesn't agree with the phrase that construction is really buying risk and selling confidence. You take the risk from the owner and you give them back confidence that you're going to deliver, right? And that's where those products like insurance and bonding come in. They're the backups to that confidence. So I think that's it's certainly a trend that we've seen, and it's an opportunity that we've taken to leverage ourselves as a differentiator. So we do work pretty hard at making sure that our packages are complete, that we're not delivering incomplete drawing sets to people, whether it's owners or contractors or construction drawings, methodologies, and in particular to that kind of last 10%, which happens to be where oftentimes the highest risk for the contractor lies, right? It's the connection design, it's how things fit together, it's the clash detection. And that can really mess up a project schedule and certainly the project's budget. So I do feel for general contractors, and in particular, I feel sensitive about it because we've had several clients that have actually really expressed a deep gratitude and appreciation for the fact that we're trying to solve that problem for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important topic because, we do a lot of project management development, project management training. We work with, technical professionals. And, like I said before, your goal is to kind of get that project done on time and on budget. And you're, of course, getting a lot of pressure from the client or the owner, whoever that, driving force is. And so, to Devlin's point, at times you're rushing plans. Like we see it all the time. We're like, hey, we don't have enough time to quality control these plans. We got to get them out the door. We got to get the bid out. The client needs to meet the deadline. And that does cause a lot of risks for other parties potentially. I mean, certainly it could be the engineer from a liability standpoint, but also the contractor in terms of they're bidding on something that could dramatically change. And then they'd have to go ahead and try to get additional funds for that. And then that opens up a whole nother can of worms that they have to deal with. So, yeah, I mean, I think that this is in the world of tight budgets and, fast deadlines. This is what, we're up against a bit here. And, I know everyone says, oh, there's plenty of money in infrastructure. There is, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy to get it and not get burned on projects, which we hear people do all the time. So that's something that we kind of got to keep in time. Now, Devlin, there has been some things around contracts. For example, I know that you have the Canadian Construction Documents Committee that has helped with some different contracts. There's AIA documentation and contracts. How do you see some of these legal frameworks kind of influencing project delivery models, like, for example, design build or IPD? What adjustments should firms be making or thinking about to kind of manage or utilize these new contract frameworks and dynamics, really, because it's kind of unfolding as we speak?
It's a great question, and it's very complicated. I think it's important to say that the majority of these big contracting document packages, like the AIA, like the CCDC, are generally happening on major infrastructure, big projects, right? It's not going to impact the majority of contractors or AEC service providers. And those teams, I'm sure, have all de-risked it as much as they can. They've got legal advice, they've got contract specialists on the team. But I also think it's fair to say that construction, in its essence, isn't likely to change very much. As I said before, it's buy risk and sell confidence. I don't see that changing very much. And with something like an alliance model where, we're all sitting in a circle around the campfire singing songs together and sharing the risk, I think it's a good idea. I just think the practicality of it is short-sighted. I don't think many of those projects really win. Now, they might win for the alliance team, but then the taxpayers pay, right? It's not a practical way to really produce a winning result. I think it's a shift away from society as it generally operates. It's a shift away from capitalism as it generally operates. It's a shift too far from those models that how have we been building for 1,000 years, and the assumption of risk by someone and the delivery of confidence in exchange for money. I don't know if they're going to change much, but I do think it's certainly, if you're going to be stepping into the world of these new risk mitigation strategies and delivery models, number one, don't dip your toe in it, like in or you're out. And if you are going to get in, make sure you've got a really comprehensive team that understands the risks that you're going to be getting involved with.
Yeah, and I think Devlin makes a really good point that you made there early on in your answer about the size of these organizations. I think a lot of times we have a lot of listeners that I'm sure are in those small to mid-sized consulting firms where you don't necessarily have, the full legal teams and you have lawyers that you could pick up the phone and call all the time. And I
Hmm.
think in this climate, you start to get pulled in as like a sub on a large project, and there are lots of complexities in these projects that you may not be familiar with or equipped to deal with as an engineer, let's say, but you don't necessarily have like that legal team at the ready to help you like some of these larger companies or even the company that you're subbing to, right? So I think if you're listening to this and you're a leader in a small to mid-sized consulting firm, as you get in with some of these new contract frameworks, some of these different, if you're getting involved in a project that has a different delivery process than you're used to, like a design build, which is very different and very complex in certain ways, you need to get help. You need to get legal advice, and you need to make sure that your technical professionals understand that they got to come to you if there's a question, if they don't understand something. We were just doing a training recently, and one of the companies we work with, they have a legal team, and then if there's a red flag, the engineer can maybe pass it over to the legal team, but the engineer needs to, number one, be aware that you have that resource, right? And then take the action to say, kind of like Devlin was saying earlier, you have to just say, hey, listen, I know we need to get this out tomorrow, right? But we got to have this lawyer look at it, because if we don't, whether or not we get it out tomorrow or in the week from now, it's not going to matter, because we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I think that those are some of the conversations that have to be had in smaller firms where they don't have those resources and they need to figure out a way to get that help.
And training, Anthony, you mentioned it there, but it's key, right? It's no good having one expert on the team. You actually need your team trained on how to leverage the expert. So it's a bit of that in-house training, and it's continued education, right? It's not something that you just do once and you're done. It's something you got to keep refreshing, because those contracts, it might be a 3 year or 4 year or 5 year project, but the contract itself, the interpretation, the meanings, it changes over time. It evolves as other climates change.
Absolutely. So, Devlin, we're talking about like changes here in this risk allocation that's really affecting liability insurance for engineers and contractors and just risk in general. We mentioned a few strategies so far, like, making sure you have legal help, doing a lot of training. Are there any other strategies or ways that you recommend firms try to protect themselves with all of these growing risks that are happening in the current climate?
I think it's we should help each other. I think every engineering association should be under pressure from its members rather than from other entities. And the members should be pushing for certain protections. I think quite often the associations, with layers of more regulation and controls and fear mongering, under the guise of trying to provide protection to end users, whether it be pedestrians or highway users, that kind of thing, can actually cause a lot of pain for the industry that's underappreciated, right? Like, think of those small, medium-sized firms now that in many cases can't compete with the big firms because of these extra levels of assurance that have been put on, these extra checks, double checking, triple checking things that's required, where the members should be saying codes are developed with input from those industry experts, and that additional checks don't necessarily increase the safety of whatever it is that you're designing. And I think as an operator, how you set up your business, so to design systems that are both robust but agile.
Hmm.
Robust in that they will stand the test of time, that they will stand a test against the regulatory requirements or the regulatory investigators, but at the same time that they're agile, that they can change and be modified and suit the needs of the project at hand.
That's very interesting. And yeah, and I think that it's just something that I like what you said about community. I think it's a great idea to get people together that are dealing with that same challenge. We have to try to help each other out. I mean, I get involved in a lot of kind of business mastermind groups to help with growing EMI, and I learned so many things from other business owners that we're in the same boat together, right? You're dealing with the same challenges, you're trying to push the same levers, so to speak. And I think we do need to create more pockets of that within the engineering community, so that maybe there is like a risk symposium or something like that, right? Where people can come together. Hey, this happened to us on a project. This is how we dealt with it. Just like kind of a heads up. And because I do think we're kind of in this together. I know you compete with other firms, but at the same time, this risk issue is going to hurt everybody. It's not going to, a lot of the same types of firms. So I think there's some value in trying to get together and kind of band up on it.
No, I love that. I love the idea of be part of the tide that rises all the boats, that
Right.
raises all the boats, right? Like that. That I think is you can still be competitive, right? There's no just because you're raising all the boats doesn't mean that you're suddenly changing the competitiveness. I think what you're doing is you're raising the game for everybody. The quality then improves if it's done by individuals and groups of engineers rather than pushed on the profession by some regulatory body or government body.
Yeah, and I think we have done a good job in some respects. Like, for example, in the US, we have the National Society of Professional Engineers that does a lot of good work with legislation for engineers. And, engineers come together as members to help promote that. But it'd be interesting to see how they deal with some of these new risk issues that are being posed with the economy and funding and legislation and design build and all
Yeah.
these things is going to be interesting to see how this unfolds. But another topic that's an interesting one that we hear a lot about these days, and I want to pick your brain on a little bit here, is AI and machine learning, which are certainly transforming civil and structural design. Could you talk a little bit about just some of your insights as to how these technologies are helping firms maybe optimize material usage and improve kind of the precision of their engineering designs?
Sure. I mean, I've seen quite a bit, and I don't claim to be an expert in the space at all. I think it's vast and it's varied, but the little bit I've seen is underwhelming generally, right? Like, I think in a specific use case, some of it can be perceived to be truly impactful and game changing, right? But really, fundamentally, construction is hard.
Hmm.
It's high risk, it's low margin, it's complicated supply chains, it's personnel that need special training, it's elaborate contracting and elaborate insurance and bonding requirements. I mean, it's really and low margin at the end of the day. So when you think of it from that perspective, how quickly can you expect the AEC industry to adopt these novel, innovative things? Like when you think about it, how different is it today? Construction different today to what it was when pyramids got built. It's bricks and mortar. So I think we have to be a little cautious with our level of optimism at how quickly AI and ML will impact things like materials. And here I'm talking about, okay, well, bridges, how quickly is that going to change? Hospitals, high rise residential. Sure, you're going to find a warehouse somewhere that was used with some innovative materials. I get it. That's cool. But I mean, the fundamentals of society, the big projects that are going to be transporting energy, that are going to be transporting commerce, I think that's where I would urge a degree of caution, because the risk appetite's not there, and the opportunity to integrate and innovate isn't there yet either. So I'm a little bit cautious in that. I would actually say that we have got a couple of folks that are working on a project right now, so that we've developed a model that can design what we would consider a commodity bridge. So it's an all steel structure. It's used in forestry and in mining, ranging from 20 feet to 120 feet long, meets all the code. And depending on the requirements of the client, we can actually have a machine design that in a matter of a couple of hours. But that's a far cry from a multi-span cable stay highway bridge.
Right.
Like that, it's just such a, they're not even in the same category. So I think let's be a little cautious, but really optimistic. I mean, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 20? I don't know, but it's pretty cool technology.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree with you. I mean, I think some of the things that are more basic, if you will, like the steel bridge you're describing, it can be up and running quicker. But I think what I find with a lot of engineering firms is that the process to implement something new is really where the challenge lies, because you have 100 engineers doing design work. All of a sudden you put a new system in place and you got to do tons of training.
Yeah,
They have to get time away from their projects to process the training, get the new software in place, try it out, test it, etc. So listen, it's coming, it's going to be good. Like you said, there's opportunities, but it's not going to be, snap your fingers and we've got all these new tools in place. They're going to be able to cut our labor time in half. That's just not the way it's going to work. But obviously, there's a lot of promising stuff going on and some exciting demos of things that I've seen. But I think, and I guess if anything, the lesson learned is in your organization is the change process, or the process that you can establish to be able to implement some of these tools, is what's going to be really important for firms going forward. Because I think the firms that can do that faster are obviously going to have an advantage. It's just like when you acquire a new company, how quickly you can integrate that firm into your firm and into the processes and tools and standards is what's going to dictate if that's ultimately going to be a successful acquisition for you. So I think really maybe it comes back to change management, but I think like Devlin said, there's obviously tons of opportunities here, and it looks like it's going to be exciting for the next 5 to 10 years to see how some of these things break in.
And if you just go back up just that tiny
Yeah.
bit to what I said earlier about your systems and processes, to ensure that you've got the capacity to innovate, you have to plan for it, right? You have to have innovation as part of your process. Not maybe on every project, but it can't be a big deal to innovate. And so your systems and processes need to be built that they're robust, that they can, stand the test of a massive project, but they need to be agile enough that from project to project you can say, let's innovate on this one, but let's stick to the process on this one. And so I think that just as a small medium sized company, if you're thinking of growing or you're thinking of adapting or including a new process, or you're going through an acquisition, I think those are key elements to include in your thinking. Is how do you maintain a robustness but maintain agility?
Yeah, I love that. And I think really building on that, AI is going to be amazing for our industry, but you have to step back and look at your process and make sure that you really know how it's going to work before you
Right.
just turn the switch on, right? Like, so it doesn't break, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to be, I think, challenging. But we've already talked to some companies, of course, on the podcast that have done some really awesome things with AI. So it's just a matter of wrapping your head around it, integrating it well into your processes, like Devlin's saying, and not using it yet where you don't need it,
Right.
right? That's I think a key. I think in all walks of business and life, right? If we're going a little bit too, we can also go a little bit too fast sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, kind of one other thing on AI for a minute here is I'm curious as to how you think it may impact project management, because I also think that that's an area where we can really leverage AI to make better decisions, manage our projects better. Anything you've seen on that, or any thoughts on AI and project management?
Well, I think there's a bunch of stuff that will immediately bear fruit. Okay, so the large language models understand language pretty well. And so
Mhm.
anything that needs a rapid understanding of language, I think you can immediately start employing the LLMs to do work for you. And so that'll start, let's say, for example, with your contract documents. I think having an AI lawyer or an AI paralegal is a great idea to start. Like at least it gives you, as a project manager, it gives you a tool that you can scan through a 500-page RFP and you can pull out the stuff that might be one of those red flags you were talking about earlier. Something that perhaps you don't understand or you don't understand the impact of. That it's a very quick way to scan through a lot of data, and you can develop some queries that then you can go and get an expert to answer for you. So without needing to send that 500-page document to a lawyer who's going to charge you $400 an hour, your project manager can actually get through a lot of that stuff early on, de-risk it from day one. And I think there are some useful applications that are currently available to us, right? But also at the same time, I think real-time decisions based on a ton of data is probably the only way that an AI is going to be better than humans. I still think that if you put it this, I heard a metaphor the other day that I had to tweak a little bit. But an orthopedic surgeon with a box cutter is still going to be better than a Neanderthal with a scalpel, right?
Right.
So if you've got a good project manager who does a good job, even with low quality tools, he's still probably going to be better than a brand new student, educated, untrained, with the fanciest tools in the toolbox. But
That's a good
I
analogy.
think it,
Yeah.
it really depends on how you set up people for success. If you're going to give them tools that are going to immediately impact their ability to deliver value versus relying on the tool to do a bunch of work. So I think there's a lot of project management tools that are perhaps trying to fall into that first box, which is to say, hire a monkey and you'll get a good project. But
Right.
it's because of this fancy tool, and I don't think that's true yet. I think we're a ways from that. I think a good project manager can do a lot with a sketchbook, a pen and paper, and a ruler.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I think it goes back to what you said earlier. Like if you say construction is kind of bricks and mortar, project management is scope, schedule, and budget, right?
Yeah,
And if you're familiar with those things and you know how to manage them effectively, it doesn't matter if you've got a pen and paper or you've got the craziest, AI app on your phone. You're probably going to figure out how to balance your scope, schedule, and budget. So I definitely agree with that. And I think the danger, I think ultimately, I think there will be some great PM tools that'll come out of it. I'm sure that can help us make some faster decisions. But I also think it can be a little bit of a trap in firms not developing their PMs, like you're suggesting, where you take a young PM or inexperienced PM and you put them on a project that they're probably not ready for
Yeah,
because you feel the AI will help them. And I think that's where we kind of need to be careful. Like it can help us in a lot of ways, but we also have to be aware of the risks, like anything else.
yeah. I think one of the coolest applications of, let's call it an AI supported bot, that I came across recently was a way to institutionalize corporate knowledge. And so then you've got this
Mm,
opportunity to take your new grad engineer who wants to be a project manager, and with a chat bot of some kind, you provide him with a resource, with a tool that he can chat to, that perhaps has all of the experience of the company, right? That somehow can access, let's say, project review documentation or project execution data. So how a project went, what went well, what went poorly. Maybe geographic related information, like if we're working in the permafrost versus working in the desert. What are the ways that I must remember to adapt my project management style based on a highly unionized work environment versus not. I think there's some pretty unique, cool things that these tools will allow project managers or engineers to do, but I still think we can trust in people for a long while. I think we're still people first.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, we had a company recently we interviewed on our project management podcast that discussed just what you were suggesting, where they had some AI that was capturing a lot of their, inherent tools and processes and things of that nature. And you would be able to ask them a question, or, it's kind
Yeah,
of creating that knowledge base for them to lean on, which I see as one way that it can be really, really, really helpful.
right.
So, Devlin, in terms of the integration of kind of robotics and automation on construction sites, that's also gaining some momentum. Just curious as to your thoughts around the adoption of autonomous equipment on construction sites and what impact might you see that having on our projects and kind of labor dynamics and things of that nature.
I think there's still a lot of fantasy in people's minds. Again, thinking of let's say you're building a hospital, or some other major infrastructure like that. There's going to be a huge gap in the trust, right? Like, did that robot lay my or check the concrete properly?
Right,
Were the rebar ties checked properly? And so I think we're still a long ways from that. But as far as quasi robotic supported activities, I mean, think of how concrete gets skimmed, like sitting on a skimmer, skimming
right,
across a warehouse floor. I mean, that, sure, I can see that turning into a Roomba of some kind, like, does that really need an operator? I think there's certain things that you can imagine could be fairly quickly adopted, because the ability to verify quality is pretty low. Like, there's a low burden to verify quality, and if the burden is low, I think the adoption rate is higher, and that's in part trust, but I think it's in part, like, who's going to assume the risk. Again, if the
right.
general contractor has bought this risk, I would think the GC is going to be more careful about verifying quality.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway for me from your answer there, which is interesting, is there's kind of two sides of the coin. Like number one, can the AI do the work? But then number two, do people believe it can do the work? Right?
Hmm.
And that's like that fear in your mind of like, oh, we're gonna have a robot build your house. Like
Right.
you are, like I don't know if I'm comfortable with that type of thing. So
Yeah.
it'll be cheaper, it'll be faster, but I
Yeah.
don't know if I'm comfortable with that. So I agree. I think that again, I think there's going to be some good uses for it and some that can start working sooner rather than later. But the adoption process for human beings is going to probably impact how fast we're seeing some of these things happen, whether it's the belief system or, like you talked about before, just the sheer process of being able to get a large number of engineers changing their habits and using a new system is,
Right.
is also a process.
And the burden of regulation, right? Like,
Right.
we are in an industry that is highly urbanized, impacting people on a very personal level. And I think the regulation is one of the hardest challenges to overcome in those environments. If you think of the relatively rapid, or not relatively, it's incredibly rapid adoption of machines and AI and robotics in the mining sector. If you look at some of the mines in Australia, you know there's half a dozen people running a multi-billion-dollar mine, and it's almost entirely automated. But it's such a different, that's not touching people. There's no,
Right.
you got half a dozen workforce to worry about. That's it. As opposed to, like I keep going back to, like building a hospital is a complicated thing, and
Yeah,
you really need to jump through a lot of hoops, cut a lot of red tape before you're going to have a robot, putting up drywall even.
for sure. The last kind of question I want to ask you around AI is just the idea of upskilling your labor force to be prepared. Kind of like, I mean, we've been talking about this a little bit, but firms are struggling a little bit to upskill their workforce. And what strategies might you recommend for firms to overcome some of the resistance that's out there to these digital tools, and develop the skills that people are going to need to actually implement and utilize some of these tools?
I would think you need a champion, right? Like I
Hmm.
think that's
Yeah,
the lowest hanging fruit for the manager, is either to be the champion or to identify a champion on the team. If you're an owner, perhaps an owner is to identify that champion somewhere in the organization. It doesn't have to be a leader in the traditional hierarchy pyramid, but it has
right.
to be someone that people will follow. I mean, that's the definition of a leader, is someone who has followers, right? So I think that champion is probably the first step. We do a lot of continued education, formal and informal. Get together, watch a YouTube video on the big screen over there, and just talk about it for 10 minutes, half an hour, over a sandwich. And I think that constant exposure, I think, also lowers barriers to resistance, because it's just now part of the conversation, as opposed to some kind of formal course that someone has to go on. I think that makes it easier. I think a risk to avoid is don't overextend. Maybe even don't extend. Like,
Mm,
take comfortable steps. Don't extend yourself into some new realm. Buy a bunch of software. Risk your systems and processes that perhaps aren't agile enough or aren't robust enough to withstand the test. I think that's something to watch for. Measure everything.
yeah,
Even if you're not going to use the data, store it up in a repository and dump it somewhere. It's going to be useful at some stage. And I think just be practical. Like, I love the idea that someone out there is building us a space rocket to Mars. Okay, I
right.
absolutely love,
Right.
but I'm not going to do it because it's not practical for me, right? So
Right.
so I think what we need in this particular area of the world is, we need better engineering that is more complete, that pays attention to details, that helps builders build, as opposed to develops a design that ends up on the cover of a magazine. I think the priority should be less ego getting on the magazine and more practicality, like helping a builder build something. And then responsiveness is respond faster. So if you can use
Yeah.
these tools to deliver that, I think we're all going to be better off, and the rates will be higher and faster.
Yeah. No, I love that. And one of the things that really resonates with me from what you just said, just based on interaction with our clients, is the one about overextending yourself. Because what I see a lot with our clients are, hey, we invested in this new ERP software. Our leadership wants it up and running by January 1st, right? And then all your project managers are freaking out because they got their projects they got to manage. Now they're trying to learn this new ERP on the fly. January 1st, everything shuts off and they're afraid their dashboards are going to explode. So
Yeah,
it creates just a lot of stress. I think it creates a lot of resistance that builds up to these tools because they're saying, if you're going to force me to use this on this timeline, it's not really good for me or my clients. And so I agree with you that there has to be a really, I mean, obviously, if you want to do something, you got to have a goal and you got to have a timeline. I get that. But you also have to be a little bit sensitive to the idea that these project managers are really the lifeline and the cash flow of your company. They're responsible for the profitability of your projects. And if you're going to mess around with the way that they're delivering them, you've got to give them the proper time to adopt something and roll it out, or else you're going to create a lot of stress. And I guarantee you, you're probably going to lose some good people in the process.
yeah. No, I agree. I agree. I think I would expand your key person from project manager to include whoever the project manager's primary connection in the field is, because I think that person also has such a responsibility on the profitability, the successful delivery of a project.
Hmm.
And that, yes, the PM is hugely responsible, but the PM is hugely responsible more on it's the ivory tower problem, right? Like, you got the PM generally sits in a nice comfy office, whereas your general superintendent or superintendent on a job site is in the snow and the rain. uh,
Right. Right.
and so both of them are to some degree equally responsible for the successful delivery. And then so whatever change you put in place, be careful what you change. Make sure it's good for both of those elements.
Yeah, I mean, all the stakeholders. I could even see how it could have come to impact the owners or the clients, right? If they're not
Yeah.
able to get them the reports they need or whatever the case may be, you really have to think about changes to your project delivery process, with all the stakeholders in mind, which is always really important.
Yeah.
So, Devlin, what final piece of advice can you give CEOs in our industry right now of kind of just staying ahead of these evolving risks and embracing the future of kind of where we're headed in engineering and construction?
Anthony, I think you're doing it. Okay, so it's I would say talk. I think if we actually talk and collaborate a bit more of that working together, I think that's
Hmm.
a sure way to understand how your peers are doing, right? Like how are they, not necessarily what secret integrations of machine learning are they adopting, right? Like I don't mean that we all have to share the secrets, but I mean if some new legislation gets passed, collaborate, go and talk, have that conversation, stop by their office, take them coffee and say, hey man, how's this thing impacting you? How are you guys adopting this change? Whether the regulators come out and say, you have to include A, B, and C in your practice management plan, go and connect
Hmm.
with one of your peers down the corridor there and say, like, how are you guys going to do this? You know that this raises this and this and this challenge. How we see it these challenges being really difficult to overcome, and we're planning to do it this way. Well, what do you guys do? And I think that kind of peerdom, the collegiate kind of peerdom, I think that's going to be incredibly valuable to any firm, small, medium, or large. Going forward, and I think that if I were to leave you with anything, is try and be the tide that raises all the boats. That's really impactful. That'll serve you well. It'll serve everybody well.
Yeah, I like that. I like that philosophy for leaders in our industry. I also like it just for like if you're managing people, right? Like, not thinking about, hey, this person's going to overtake me. No, no, you want to raise everybody up and help everyone to do the best they can. And I think that, what you said about just communicating and connecting with other people in our industry, I really think is going to be the key. And I think that, part of, I think, a big takeaway from my conversation today with Devlin is thinking about how you can connect with other leaders in the industry to try to talk about how we can tackle some of these things together and share a challenge that happened to you.
Yeah,
Call up a CEO from another company and say, hey, listen, we dealt with this. How about you? I know CEOs that are in groups together all the time and they have these conversations. So we got to promote more of that.
yeah.
And I appreciate you coming on and talking about it. So once again, Devlin Fenton. Devlin's the CEO of Arch Engineers. Devlin, thanks so much for spending some time with us here on the Civil Engineering CEO.
It was really great. Thanks, Anthony, for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Devlin. Really awesome stuff about just risk, AI, and the adoption of AI in the civil infrastructure world. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.